So this week we continue with the story about why the church changed from the celebration of Passover, which Yeshua fulfilled as the Passover lamb, to the celebration of Easter, which is essentially the celebration of the goddess Ostra. And last week I finished with the story about God telling the Hebrews to paint their doorposts with the blood from a lamb that was to be slaughtered in order that they could be protected from the plague of death, which was to come over the firstborn of the Egyptians. And I'm going to continue with that story now and begin here on this session by saying God instructed Moses to tell the Hebrews that this day of Passover shall be a day of remembrance for them forever, and that they should celebrate this feast every year at exactly the same time, the 14th day of the first month, according to what would become the Hebrew calendar. They should also eat unleavened bread for 7 days from Passover as a yearly remembrance of the most significant event in their time in Egypt and our history. That night, as the Hebrews ate the lamb in their homes, the lintels and doorposts of their homes being painted by the blood of the lamb, the Lord passed through the land of Egypt and fulfilled his promise to destroy the firstborn of all in Egypt. A terrible cry was heard throughout the land as the Egyptians woke to the punishment they had received for their unwillingness to release the Hebrews from slavery. This realization that the God of the Hebrews is all powerful and determined to set his people free from slavery caused Pharaoh to release the Hebrews from captivity in Egypt in the year of 1250 BC. Which was actually, and interestingly, the biblical year of 1948. I say this interestingly because Israel became an independent state again in the year 1948 AD, after a 2,000-year period of persecution whilst they lived in the nations of the world. The Hebrews, already and well fed with bread in their hands and dressed to run, wasted no time and fled from Egypt as soon as Pharaoh relented. They headed for the Sinai desert, but Pharaoh changed his mind about releasing them and pursued them, wanting to destroy them. The Hebrews continued to run and came to the Red Sea, an area known as the Sea of Reeds. They had no hope of crossing without divine help. And that came from God, who, of course, would never abandon his people. He opened the sea and the Hebrews crossed. Pharaoh and his army continued in pursuit, but as they began to cross the sea, God released the water to flow again, and Pharaoh and his army drowned. So the Hebrews reached the desert where God dwelt with them, providing all their needs and teaching them the ancient ways of worship and living in harmony with God and each other. What I'm about to say is very important for us to understand today, which is that we read in the book of Leviticus that God was strong and clear in telling the Hebrews that they must never go back to worshipping the gods of the Egyptians or follow their customs, as this would take them back into spiritual enslavement. He also made it clear that they should not follow the ways and customs of those living in the land of Canaan, a land God was giving them to live in as their own land forever. That land being the promised land. So what were they doing in Egypt and Canaan that God didn't want them to follow? They were worshipping the gods which were instituted by the Babylonians. Gods, as I have described earlier, deities such as the calf. But for my purposes in writing this and telling you this story, the worship of the fertility goddess. The worship practices of these gods had specific times and specific symbols. For instance, the fertility goddess was worshipped at the time of the spring equinox, and the symbols were such things as the rabbit and the egg, since that is when most births take place, of course. The worship of Mithras, the sun god, was celebrated at what was considered to be his birth, and that was the time of the winter solstice, and his symbols were evergreen foliage and the evergreen tree, amongst other things, of course. Notice both these times of worship to the gods of Egypt and Canaan were connected to the sun. Now, I want to remind you of what I wrote earlier in the book of Leviticus, or what God wrote earlier in the book of Leviticus in chapter 23 about his appointed times, including Passover. Whilst they were in the desert, God gave the Hebrews a detailed description of both the timings and the manner in which they were to celebrate his feasts, which God instructed were to be held every year forever in a remembrance of what he had done for them in helping them escape the tortures of captivity in Egypt. After 40 years in the desert, which I would describe as a very long study course in the learning of the ways of the God of Israel, and which we are all to bring them and ourselves today back to into a deep relationship with God, our Heavenly Father, they were now ready to move on to Canaan. God then allowed them to go into the promised land of Canaan, which became the land of Israel. The name Israel meaning God prevails. Since that time, God expected them to keep his feasts and his celebrations, but they didn't always do that, and often did return to the spiritual practices of Egypt and Canaan and the pagan countries which surrounded them. There was such a strong spiritual pull on the lives of the Israelites to move away from God's ways that it is clear there was much more to these appointed times of God than just remembrance. There had to be a significant spiritual importance to the practices of God's calendar of worship. Whilst in Israel, the prophets of God were actively speaking about God's intentions, not only to remember him and his ways, but also about what would happen if they didn't keep to his ways. The consequences of not doing so would be enslavement and captivity. This time, not by Egypt alone, but by the pagan nations which surrounded them. However, the prophets of God had another message, and that was that God would send them a Messiah, a deliverer, to free not only them, but those in the rest of the world who wanted to be free from the spiritual powers of the pagan nations and their gods. So thank you very much for listening today. Thank you for being with me. And I just want to say Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Mike Fryer, Wales.